Hey everybody, it's the Gameology podcast. I am one of your hosts, Matthew Falvine.
And I'm Attila Gabriel Mineski.
And we are talking about card games.
Yes, both trading card games, or TCGs, and collectible card games, or CCGs.
All right, now Attila, you have a lot more experience with card games, so why don't you get the ball rolling?
Yeah, well, I was of the generation that, when I was little, Pokemon cards were a huge phenomenon, and I didn't even learn how to play the game. I just wanted to collect them all. And I had a very generous mom who bought me card packs as a reward for like getting stripes in my karate belt and that kind of thing. And
for training at the gym.
And then similarly, I got into Yu-Gi-Oh as well. And then that also became a sort of like a reward kind of thing. Anytime there was an occasion or something, I get a pack of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And yeah, then I managed to get a copy of like Yu-Gi-Oh! The Eternal Duelist Soul for Game Boy Advance, and that was a lot of fun because suddenly I had access to like way more cards in the video game than I would ever have in real life. And I could construct decks and strategies that all followed and required specific cards that I could get a hold of, because the game had a means of like, you would enter the pin code off of a card and it would read into the game. But then, of course, magazines just came out which published the code for every single card, so you could just build your collection that way. And then, most recently, I got you into Hearthstone, and it's something that I've been playing a lot myself. So we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, my experience with it, other than like traditional card games, a friend got me into Star Wars cards in high school. And before that, I remember being at a movie theater and an older kid who I'd never talked to in high school, how there's kind of that divide. He must have thought that maybe I would be into it. And he asked me, he's like, "Hey, Matt, do you play Magic the Gathering?" And I could tell he didn't want his other friends to know, but he had a feeling that Matthew, the video game kid, might know. I was like, and it just really blew me away because he was like a redneck truck driving, motorcycle riding son of a bitch. And he wanted to talk about mana and wizards. Star Wars cards was a game that we got really heavily into and had a good group of friends that would play it as well. And it introduced me to a lot of the mechanics of card games, especially in the part where for the first time I felt like I was gambling as a child, because you were buying these packs and you were hoping to get luck of the draw to get the more powerful cards. And I remember going and buying packs and not getting what I wanted and having this frustrating moment. I blew like, a month's worth of newspaper bike money. And I had a really kind of empty feeling inside where I felt like that was a mistake. I felt like this is what people probably feel like that are gambling addicts, and I'm 14. And in a way, it's good to learn those lessons young before you end up, mortgaging your house.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that really separates gambling from these kinds of card games is that in a lot of ways, like, you can't directly exchange the cards for value.
Although they do a very good job of making you think that. Putting your rare cards in cases, buying the magazines and saying, "Oh, a mint condition Darth Vader is worth this much."
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's with physical cards, there's always this idea of like the resale that generates this kind of like additional value for all these cards that perhaps the game developers didn't intend but can't really do anything to prevent.
And I always think that by the time you'd ever want to actually sell it, it would be so worthless. I mean, I don't pay attention. Maybe there's like a huge market for a mint condition Darth Vader card, but those games, especially Star Wars cards, a really long drawn out game. I'm not sure how long a game of Magic takes. I know with Hearthstone, I really enjoy that a game is 10, 15 minutes or shorter, but I remember with Star Wars cards, it was a really long, like maybe multiple hours, lots of, it was a big learning curve to get into to understand the turn order, especially if you didn't have any experience with those. But it was something that we really got into, and then creating your own sort of decks. However, at that time, because it's a physical game and you're relying on buying packs of cards, like you were saying with Yu-Gi-Oh, you're limited to what you can do. I mean, there's only so many ways you can organize the cards that you have without having to go out and buy more, hence their whole profit model.
Absolutely. And you even have the issue of like, how do you ensure that you have at least the sort of core set of cards that you can get started with? Like some of these companies actually do distribute like a starter set, and sometimes that's just like, hey, you just bought 10 packs of cards and you better hope that what you need is in there. And sometimes they're actually going to give you like, okay, no, these are the cards that you absolutely need to get started, and then here's the other ones that you can sort of mix in and create at least a basic deck that will work and has some intrinsic synergies and that kind of thing.
Which Hearthstone does really well.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very good at providing you almost everything you need right off the bat, and then you're just able to like mix and match the sort of special characters. However, something that, as I'm learning more about this game, I realize there's a power creep that happens, and as the newer sets come out that cost money, those decks contain cards that are just pound for pound better than the ones that you have, and can be incredibly frustrating to lose to somebody that has cards that just cost more money than yours.
Yeah. And I mean, like whenever you get like a sort of traditional like pack of cards, when you get cards that are like otherwise worthless, like what do you do with them? At least in the digital card space, you can do this thing in Hearthstone specifically called disenchanting, where you can turn a card into dust, and then the dust can be invested in a card that you actually want. In real life, in theory, you can trade those cards away to somebody who somehow doesn't have it yet, but if it's truly like a sort of basic card that it's so common that everyone has it, it's just absolutely worthless. Like, it's not even worth the paper it's printed on. You practically may as well toss them in the recycling for all it's worth, and then you are literally just throwing money away.
Yeah, and it kind of comes down to the point where then it would make more sense for you to just buy the single cards, hence why this market comes around of selling these rare cards for, big sums of money.
Yeah, exactly. Because if there's a card that you need, that you like absolutely have to get, then it's like, how else do you construct a deck around that? How else do you stand a chance if not just like going out and purchasing exactly the cards that you need?
Which I always, playing a lot of Hearthstone, I just keep thinking about chess and how beautiful a game chess is, because you have a various amount of abilities within the different characters, the knights, the bishops, whatever. But everybody it starts in the same place, and I think there's a real beautiful simplicity in that, where there's no frustration. It was just your strategy against their strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the ideal sense of it, but eventually, if you play enough Hearthstone and you get to a high enough level, not that I am in that competitive level, but I've been playing the game for so long that naturally I just have a certain set of like later game cards, because I've never actually paid money for packs in that game, and I would advise that anyone who's looking to get into Hearthstone never pay money for cards, which is unfortunately not a piece of advice that I imparted to you soon enough.
I was pretty lucky. I came in and they had the welcome bundle. It was $5. You got 10 packs, and I think they gave you a higher amount of like a one legendary card was going to be in there. So I was able to use by focusing on one class and kind of getting rid of the good cards from the other classes, I was able to get almost everything I needed. I'm at the point now where I have everything I need in that sense, because you're right, they do a great job of handing it over to you, and we'll talk about that in the progression side of things. But there still are those wings. Now, did you pay for the 3 adventures? Like,
with the very first one, which was the expansion Curse of Naxxramas, I didn't pay for. I ground to get enough currency for it. From in-game rewards, and then the other 2 wings I did purchase.
And in the end, I can see that, I mean, games can't be free. There has to be some way of the money going into it, and I like that business model of it, where you're going to pay, but you're going to get a single-player experience, and you're going to get these guaranteed cards, as opposed to just paying for these packs where you could end up with, 10 hundreds of pieces of crap and not the thing you actually wanted.
Yeah, and like, when you're buying all these extra packs, you can at least disenchant them, and that, as opposed to the wings where you're paying like a lot of money for those cards though. So it's a good justification that there's at least some fun matches that you're going to have as you're playing through these things, because otherwise it would be a ridiculous investment for just the cards that you're getting, because you're not getting that many cards. It might be like 40 cards for $30. Something like that.
Yeah.
And it's only 40 because it's 2 of everything, most cards. And a lot of the cards that you're getting are rewards, are legendaries, where you can only put, in Hearthstone specifically, you can only put 1 legendary card of a kind in your deck.
Is that card, I haven't bought the expansions yet. When you buy them and you unlock them, are you given to them, or you just have the ability to enchant them?
You're given them. You're given them. Don't worry. That's they're not that heartless.
Because I'm at a point right now where there are 3 to 5 cards that I would love to get out of those 3 expansions, and I was making a little chart, because I'm like, if I'm going to put my money into it, and they did such a brilliant job of putting about 2 in each of them, that by my number crunching and just endless research over this last week or so, it's like those ones are considerably better, and those are absolutely necessary. But I'm at the point where I've had so much fun and so much time invested in this game to put down $60 for 3 expansions. I've had more fun with this than I have with a lot of games I've spent more on. So I don't feel like a moron for buying it.
Yeah, and that's perfectly reasonable. It's the same reason that I invested in the card packs myself, just because I figured like, hey, I'm having enough fun with this, and it would take a really long time to grind for the currency, and ultimately this is how they would win you over. Like we talked a lot about this in our microtransaction episode not that long ago. But the other thing that sort of like Hearthstone has going for it, and really card games in general, there's the constructed play, which as time goes on, like you build these decks using the cards that you accumulate over time, and unfortunately, you do kind of naturally find that some constructed decks are strictly better than others. Like you can't just throw together any combination of cards and expect it to work. There are certain cards that just combo really well with other cards. There are certain cards that only work really well for certain classes. Like in Hearthstone, there are exclusive 9 different classes that have cards that are exclusive to that class, and then a pool of common cards which any class can use. Mm-hmm. But within that common pool are some cards that are just clearly designed to be used by a specific class.
Well, and also if you, like a common beginner mistake is just to go through and pick all the great cards you like, regardless of how they work. And in a game that has 30 cards where you're not going to get access to all those cards throughout, you need to be the most effective. You need to make sure that they are going to synergize almost at all times. So if a card that you can play on turn 1, is it as useful if you get it on turn 6 as it is on turn 1? And if not, you can't prepare for that. So you need to make sure that for me, that's almost more like probably neck and neck with as fun as playing the game is constructing those cards, because you have a limited amount of space, and really how everything works together is like a real beauty of those kind of games.
And I think that, unfortunately, over time, that fun of construction goes away, because eventually you just find out that like other people have constructed better decks, and you're just better off following those guides and building your decks in accordance with what these people have suggested, because it's just, there are some people who are just going to be better at the game than you are. They're not trying to keep their decks a secret, because in the act of playing against them, you'll find out what their cards are anyway. So they just go online and publish, hey, here's the deck I used to get to like rank number 1 in the country, and you can build it too. And for a long time, there are just certain dominant strategies in Hearthstone until they started changing the game meta. Do you know what I mean by meta?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for anyone who's not exactly familiar, with all the cards that are available in Hearthstone, that makes up and the like some cards being better or worse, like because there are some cards, they're not all perfectly balanced. Some cards are strictly better and strictly worse than others, mathematically speaking, and it mostly depends on where that card follows on a power curve, because every card that in Hearthstone has a power cost associated with it, and it's very similar to like Yu-Gi-Oh! They would have like a power cost associated with them. And in Yu-Gi-Oh! You could play a card if you'd played a weak one first, and then you sacrifice the weak card to play the more powerful card. So that's their way of like handling it. You can't play more powerful cards. In a Hearthstone, every turn you get like 1 mana on your first turn, 2 mana on your second turn, and then cards have a mana cost associated with them. So if you're playing a 1/1 card on turn 1, it's already not great. There are other cards that you can play that have better stats. Maybe that 1/1 has some special ability associated with it, which is why it's a low power. Because by contrast, when you get up to like turn 2, you can have like cards that either have 3 attack power and 2 hit points, or 2 attack power and 3 hit points, or even some other combination. Or some condition whereby a 2 mana card will have better stats than a 2/3 or a 3/2, like a 2/4 maybe, but that there's some other condition that buffs them or makes them more powerful. And as these cards, some of them being strictly better, some of them being strictly worse, people start to construct decks around these, really just like min-maxing and trying to find the best cards that fall into every slot and the best synergies that accompany those. And this all constitutes the meta. The only way the meta changes is by cards either being removed, banned for being too powerful, in the physical card games, that's all you can do. You can just say, you're not allowed to play this card. It's too overpowered. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there are so many cards that I used to love to play with as a kid that are just like banned for being like way too powerful. And similarly in Hearthstone, they don't ban cards, but they have the ability, since this is a digital card game, to go in and modify everyone's cards. So there was one card called Leroy Jenkins, which used to have a lower mana cost, which means you can play this card that can attack the very same turn it's played, and it was really powerful, and a lot of people would combo it in such a way where they would just perform something called a one-turn kill, where just using a couple cards in hand, they would make it so that they just demolish their opponent in one turn. And the designers felt that that wasn't in the spirit of the game, so they made the mana cost of Leroy Jenkins increase by 1, and suddenly everyone's Leroy Jenkins is suddenly that much more expensive. And that's something you can only do in a digital card game, and I'd say that's a huge advantage, because rather than just banning the card and making it worthless, you can still play it, it's just a little more balanced.
And another huge advantage of it being digital is that you can keep track of so many numbers. And we're talking about this with board games, but I imagine when I'm playing this digitally, I think this might be kind of fun to sit down and play with real cards. And then I'm like, I don't want to keep track of like health 6, health 2. There's so many numbers flying around, little counters and massive. The games would probably take 2 to 3 times as long.
Yeah.
You could easily be accused of cheating if you didn't have a damage counter in the one place. You could forget about something. And it's like when a computer is involved, no one complains about being a cheater anymore. You just complain about something being broken.
Yeah. Specifically, Yu-Gi-Oh would introduce a lot of mechanics that worked really well in the like physical card space. If a monster has a attack stat, and if you are using a monster to attack another monster, their attack stats clash, and if your attack stat is higher than their attack stat, then it destroys it. Similarly, a monster can be in defensive position, and then its defense stat is what the attack stat is compared against. But basically, you're only comparing one set of stats, and something either wins or loses. It doesn't diminish. And that makes it easier to keep track of. You don't have to like put damage counters on something as you would have to in either like Magic the Gathering or in Pokemon, or a lot of other card games relied on that kind of thing. And then where Yu-Gi-Oh kind of loses it in the transition to digital, like, as much as I loved my digital copy of Yu-Gi-Oh! Eternal Duel of Soul, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a big thing about trap cards, which were things that you could play during your opponent's turn. And they would do something, and then you'd be like, no, you just activated my trap card, and it's become a meme unto itself, because you flip over a card, and it nullifies the effect of their card, or it does something else adverse to them. But that works really well in a physical space, because you can interrupt your opponent. In the digital space, as I was sort of mentioning last episode, what they effectively had to do was every time you do something, it would flash a prompt on the screen that says, your opponent has done this. Do you want to activate a trap card? It's like, dismiss, 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 dismiss. No,
wow.
No, I don't.
It's like the Windows 10 of card games.
Yeah. And that's why when Hearthstone designed traps, or secrets is what they're called. Yeah. When Hearthstone designed secrets, they made them specifically so that they would activate on your opponent's turn, but they activate automatically. The advantage, the strength in Yu-Gi-Oh! Of having a trap that you can choose to activate is that your opponent can play something and you can say, oh, it's not worth wasting my trap on this. I'll wait for something more powerful. In Hearthstone, a secret triggers automatically, and it creates this counterplay of like, oh, my opponent has a secret down. I'm going to try and play around it. I'm going to play this card, which is like a weak spell, and then if they have a counterspell secret, then no big deal. They're not going to be able to counter my more powerful spell that I play afterwards. So it has its own strengths.
Yeah, it becomes more of you're trying to predict what the other opponent is doing, and they can easily sort of like bait out a trap.
Yeah.
Which is it's a different layer of strategy.
Yeah. It's Hearthstone is exceptionally well designed for the digital card space. Magic the Gathering has a lot of these kind of interrupts as well, and I don't feel like it's as bad as Yu-Gi-Oh! When it made the transition to digital. I tried out a Magic the Gathering app in the 2015 edition. It was rough. The UI in that game was not very friendly. I feel like there was a lot they could have done to make the game more accessible.
Why? Would it insult you when you made bad moves?
No. It was just like hard to use, like just unintuitive. maybe, I don't know, these people didn't adhere to certain tenets of just strictly good UI design in general. Like, not even to do with being a card game, but just that UI was bad.
Now, were there things that they could improve on, or is it just that they're hamstringed by the fact that you're taking a physical card game?
It's nothing to do with Magic. It's just that these people probably were not very good UI designers. Not that they didn't throw a lot of money at it, not that they didn't make it look fancy, but when it comes to creating UI, looking fancy is the last thing you care about. So maybe we'll do an episode talking about UI sometime.
Sure.
But there's just a lot of visual elements to that, which doesn't translate super well. So I won't get into what specifically failed about the Magic the Gathering app. But suffice to say, bringing certain card games into the digital space doesn't work super well, which is why when you have a card game being played in the digital space, it has to concede some things that only work well and in the physical space and vice versa. So everything has their like clear delineations of like what works well where. And yeah, Hearthstone is a game which I'm sure you've felt. It's nice. It's much more casual than a lot of these card games because the ability to interrupt your opponent's actions and do things during their turn leads to a lot more inherent complexity. Hearthstone also adheres to the idea of like what a card does has to fit on a very small bit of text. Like if it's not intuitive or understandable as to what that card does inside that space,
very good point.
They won't bother with it.
That's a really good point. I was actually, an action had happened and I went and I was really amazed at how much they can fit and be so clear. I mean, I think that it's a real triumph that they can have it still feel like it's complex somewhat. And I think that that's really about as far as you need to go for a game like that. I mean, they just nailed that fine line of just complex enough.
Yeah. On the other hand, it's probably one of the reasons that one of my friends stopped playing the game, and it's eventually the reason that I don't know if it's the specific reason that I stopped playing the game, but just once you realize that they're kind of limited in what they're capable of doing with the design space that they've allowed for themselves,
right?
The matches tend to stagnate, especially, I keep coming back to this, but the idea that people keep building these constructed decks. And once you realize that you can't do better than a constructed deck, and then you just have to fall in line and buy the deck and learn to play it, what's the fun in that anymore? And
well, but I mean, sorry, keep going.
Sorry, that's why Hearthstone has another mode called Arena. I don't know if you've gotten into that at all. Yeah,
that's where you're choosing randomly selected cards, one out of three, and building a deck and then going with it.
Yeah, and it's very similar to a mode of play in Magic called Draft. In Draft, I'll explain the traditional example first. You basically go with a bunch of friends and you buy a bunch of booster packs. And then every one of you opens a pack, picks a card that you like out of it, pass to the side, and then you are given a card, a pack minus one card from the person to your left. You pass to the right, and eventually you pass these cards all the way around to the point where you've depleted all the card packs, but you're left with a pile that you've chosen for yourself. And it's a great way for them to make a whole bunch of money. It's also a great way for you to end up with a deck that's not constructed. It's constructed by your own choice, but it's not something that you've looked up online. You're just doing the best with your intuitive knowledge of the game. And Hearthstone plays on this much the same way in its arena format, where you're presented one of three cards, and you pick one of them, the other two are discarded, and then you do this 30 times, and then you go into an online pool of other people who have similarly elected to play arena.
But if you look at chess or checkers, I mean, those are constructed decks. You're always going to have the same combination of bishops, rooks, pawns, queens, kings, and in a way that brings the competition back to just the strategy versus the strategy. So if I'm playing this, if we're both playing the same deck, however, you run into the wall of, let's say, a tempo warrior deck or whatever they call them. I mean, there are like these 6 or 7 decks. If you watch any of these Hearthstone championships, they all have these specific names for them. So it could come down to the fact like this deck is good against this one. You're basically playing rock, paper, scissors, and then hoping you just have rock at the right time. Yeah.
And I think that it's you lose some of the interest because you're not having this idea of like a sort of jack of all trades deck, master of none. You know, if you have a jack of all trades deck and you go up against one of these constructed decks, you're going to lose. In the general sense, you might win more often, But if you there's just like this Achilles heel of like these some of these decks are just very weak against other super constructed decks. But if you're a really good player, again, I've said this about Hearthstone before. If you're a good player and you have bad cards, you will win against someone who's a bad player or a new player or whatever, even if they went and bought all these cards.
Absolutely, because it all comes down to choice. You have multiple choices you can, like sort of the meta that I'm running to, and I noticed that as I climb up in the ranks, it's a completely different game. I mean, I was sailing, once I'd sort of it clicked and I figured out a bit more of effective strategy, I started sailing through it, and then you hit the next wall and you start seeing a lot of really similar decks, and you see a really similar playstyle where people have these combos loaded up for what you're going to do, and it becomes a real kind of baiting game where you don't want to overcommit just because you have it. It's kind of like if you were playing Monopoly and you had Boardwalk, Park Place, and everything else, and you just load it up and throw it at the hotels, but then I had a card that said, stock market crash, everyone loses their homes, I win. So it's in a way that becomes like another layer of the strategy where it's not pushing your hand too much and sort of walking that line and avoiding people's nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of like opportunities that are created for swing in Hearthstone, these certain cards that just... The so-called board clears, which like deal a whole bunch of damage to your entire opponent's board and usually kill everything on them. All the classes have some form or fashion of board clears that like help get rid of things. And you can learn to play around them, but sometimes there's just really not a lot you can do if your opponent just happens to have that. And it can definitely be frustrating because you can be building up to something and then your opponent just plays one card and it's just all gone.
Definitely that is the most frustrating when you're trying to push an advantage. I understand like having a nice combination of cards or picking the right time to do it, but when it's just kind of a one card removes that card, you end up playing where you don't want to, you're baiting all the time. It's like you're going to send out something that looks threatening enough that they're going to reveal their silver bullet, and then you say, thanks for taking the silver bullet for me, here's the real threat.
And then they just find another way of removing it because you're playing against a priest, and a priest has a million removal.
They do. This like one card goodbye. I mean, one of the most frustrating things I keep running to as playing paladins is change everyone's health to 1, and then deal 1 damage to everybody.
Oh yeah,
and
the equality consecration combo.
And that doesn't cost a lot. I mean, that's
6 mana.
Yeah, and
the cost is in having both cards.
Right.
Card combo cost is something that a lot of people overlook. They say like, "Wow, this card is really powerful," or "This card's really powerful." One of the best ways to think about it is that you'll see a card that says 1 mana, give a minion Divine Shield, which means it takes no damage. A different card, 1 mana, give a creature +3 attack. Each of those cards only costs 1 mana.
Right.
Then they made a card that says give a minion Divine Shield and +3 attack. 1 + 1 is 3. It costs 3 mana because it's one card. Because having that one card is far more likely than having both other cards separate, and it allows you to fit both of those cards into one in your deck rather than having them taken up 2 separate slots.
Absolutely. Now, in the case of Hunter, and one of the walls I'm running up to not having the expansions is that there is a fantastic spell that is 2 mana and does 3 damage. It's called Quick Shot, and it's in one of the expansions. Now, doing 2 mana for 3 damage is a decent percentage.
Yeah.
There is one that is only 1 mana and does 2 damage. Now, percentage-wise, that's a lot better. I mean, you're doubling your damage to mana ratio. However, hunters don't get that many cards. You need to make your cards count, and that's just one short of like true effectiveness. And that if you're only going to have so many cards to play in the game, the how many cards you have is a huge resource that needs to be accounted for.
Absolutely. And that's something that you would look into in any specific kind of game. Like one of the big things in Magic that I am familiar with is the idea that in Magic, rather than getting mana given to you turn by turn, you have to play cards called lands, and you get your mana from the lands. So if you're playing a predominantly green or forest deck, then you throw down a forest card. You can only play 1 land per turn unless you have some other modifiers or whatever. And the next turn, when you tap that land, you get 1 mana, and then you can use that mana to play something that costs 1 mana.
Okay.
One specific forest mana. Because then you might be running a combo deck where you might have a card that is like a blue card, like a water, and you might throw down the blue land card, and then you might have to tap specifically like 1 forest and like 1 green and 1 blue mana to play something. So then it's actually, even though Magic has 5 types, 5 red, green, blue, black, white, and then Hearthstone has the 9 sort of classes. Because in Magic you're allowed to create any combination of those two, like you can create a pure red deck, or you can make a red-blue deck or a red-green deck or whatever.
So many more possibilities of decks.
So there's so much, and it definitely creates an interesting layer of complexity, whereas Hearthstone is definitely going for simplicity.
Simplicity and maybe a bit more personality in that way, where you're developing specific cards for a class that sort of flesh it out a little more. One of the things that surprised me about Hearthstone, when I looked at it from afar, I'm like, it's just cards. It just looked like you're playing Crazy Eights or something. It looked kind of boring to me, but I didn't realize how interesting I would find the characters and the profiles of these static images that bash together, like a 7-year-old trying to make his own show. And that goes a long way. And I see where they're going with that in a way to make it casual. It kind of feels like Hearthstone started off trying to be so basic and is now trying to shoehorn in a bit more of the advanced strategies, while at the same time trying to inject goofy Blizzard craziness that can result in RNG taking over.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about our, this in luck versus skill not that long ago. Is like when you have a card that enables first swing, that's in theory it's a good thing, because if you play something effectively, even if it's powerful or whatever, it's at least you're giving somebody who's behind a chance to stay in the game, and it's not just ensuring that one player is always dominating the match. But when that, like if it's 2 cards that come together, there's sort of the equality consecration combo, that's something that somebody has been able to draw both of them, and that's their luck. But then the skill is using them in combination with one another. And
the skill is also planning the deck accordingly so that if you get those separated, are they still going to be synergistic otherwise? And also not playing something too early and like waiting for the perfect time to play it. Just because you have 2 copies doesn't mean you can guarantee you're going to get that second one, and saying that, I didn't draw it, is not a luck thing. It's resource management.
But then you have another card called Hopes and Yogg Saron.
Oh, is he the guy that casts random spells?
Yeah. You play this one
hilarious card.
And for every spell that you've cast in the game, it casts another spell with its target chosen randomly.
And random spells.
Yeah, and that's just like, okay, so you play this and you either lose or win the game. Yeah. Sometimes. Or nothing happens. And it just, that much swing, that much like just randomness is infuriating. Because if you've like played a really effective match up to that point and someone throws that down and they just grab victory from the jaws of defeat, it's like, God damn it. You don't want to play Hearthstone for a week after that point. Similarly, if you are doing reasonably well in a game, you actively don't want to play Yogg Saron because it might just like ruin everything you've built up to at that point. So that much RNG is just a little overboard for my taste.
And I mean, this is just us maybe, playing competitively at home, but when you have this in a tournament of some kind, it's a little bit ludicrous. Like, I understand Blizzard wants to make these games for fun, but when this is a genuine esport and money's at stake and somebody puts down Yogg Saron, I mean,
I don't think anyone's going to be playing Yogg Saron on tournament level. It's just not. It's too much to like. You don't want to lose. Like, you and I, we feel bad about losing because of something like this. If you're playing in a tournament with prize money, you don't want to lose because you had a bad luck on Yogg Saron.
Right, and I guess the plan of just keeping him around in case you need to come from behind is taking up another valuable spot in a 30-card deck.
Yeah, exactly. Because the possibilities of playing that card are so powerful that you can either win, lose, or nothing. Winning the game because of playing Yogg Saron is only one of effectively 3 possible outcomes. I know the math on that is terrible. It's not actually 1/3 chance win, 1/3 chance lose, 1/3 chance nothing. But statistically, that's about the average of what happens. It either like does a bunch of crazy stuff and then destroys everything that it's done, or it deals so much damage to the player that played it that it tanks you and makes you like in a position that you're going to lose, or it does so many amazing things that it puts you in a great position to win. Those are the possibilities that I'm weighing out. But because two of those possibilities effectively mean that it's not helping you swing back and get back into the game, for constructed play, for play in tournaments and that kind of thing, I don't think you'd ever see it. In contrast, when you're playing it in something like draft or arena, maybe you'd go for it. Probably still not, because there are rewards in arena that you want to get those awards. You don't want to be screwed out of them. Whenever you're offered a legendary card in the arena sort of draft, they give you 3 legendaries to pick from. If Yogg-Saron is your best choice of those legendaries, oh man, I feel sorry for you. But it definitely highlights the fact that certain cards are more powerful in arena and in draft play than they would be in constructed. In fact, there are some cards that are only viable in arena and are completely non-viable in constructed, and vice versa.
Yeah, in arena, because you're picking everything on a 1-card basis and you have no guarantee that you can find the proper synergistic card.
Yeah.
You're looking for cards that stand alone and then can do the most efficient.
You are, and then you're also looking at for just like a general kind of synthesis. This is why people who are really good at Hearthstone, the skills that you learn, like if you play nothing but constructed, and then you switch over to playing arena, the skills that you learn in constructed don't necessarily apply to arena, because you might end up you learn about these synergies, and that's all well and good for the constructed play. But if you don't understand the core mechanics of what makes Hearthstone tick, if you don't understand the principles of constructing a good mana curve of like different power levels, and good spell levels, and I'm not even good enough to create an effective arena deck.
Not even you.
No, I'm just saying that like even after years of playing, it's not necessarily enough to automatically know how to create a good arena deck. There are people who are amazing at creating arena decks, and it's fun to watch them puzzle through and figure out how they're putting this deck together. But it can be a little frustrating to have been playing the game for 2 years and then try out arena, and it's just like, I still don't know how to play this. I'm still not effective. I'm still just like wasting my in-game currency on this. But it's definitely interesting, and I think that keeps a lot of people in the game, so I'd much rather see it expanded upon.
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea in the way that they're offering 2 vastly different play styles simply by just switching up which cards are available. And not even that, not switching up which cards are available, just switching up the way you're allowed to choose them, because you might use the same cards in both. It's just the combination of it and the availability of it. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing to have somebody just sort of think on their feet throughout the entire process. It's much more like improv as opposed to carefully constructing a deck and trying to go out there and perform it like a play.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's just about everything I wanted to say regarding card games.
Yeah, I'd say one of the strengths of Hearthstone that has had me into it is session length, the ability to play a game very quickly, to play it on multiple platforms against other people on multiple platforms. It's very, very social in that way. It's definitely contributed to the reason that I've gotten so into it, and the deck construction as well. I find it's a game that when you're playing competitive, when you lose, it just lights the fire in me to go through. You know what I would love is if after you lost, you're able to take a look at like a turn-by-turn summary. I want to see like what happened here. Look at my choices and see like where you could inject something else in there, because I'm still not going off of these net decks, these constructed decks.
I refuse to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll look at them for maybe some inspiration, but for me, the carrot I'm chasing is to come up with something completely unique that can bust one of those ones down. And and that's can get frustrating when you're banging your head against the wall, but it is something that I just think that's almost most of the fun is like can be putting those together, and then arena is a whole other ballgame. When we were playing Star Wars cards, before internet was, fully readily available. I had a friend buy a magazine, and he put together the first deck we'd ever seen. That was a strategy, and he won every game. And when you're a kid, you can, even though you know it's coming, you think, come on, idiot kid, just if you know it's coming, plan for it. But when you're an idiot kid who doesn't have like the cards,
resource to look at.
Yeah. So I only have so many combinations of stormtroopers. So it was that stupid Hoth base deck, and I'll never forget that. And it was like, it kind of took the fun out of it in a way. So there you go. Our thoughts on card games.
I think there's one other thing that I'll mention actually. Sure. When you're creating these card games, like obviously when you're selling the physical packs of cards, as I said, you're effectively sometimes packaging cards that aren't worth the paper they're printed on.
Yes.
Similarly, in the digital space, you're at least allowed to put the less valuable cards towards the more powerful cards. Now, here's the thing. If you have stats, if this is an online game where you are logging players' purchasing behavior of these card packs, how do you get around the motivation for, say, a developer to look at a player like you who has actually spent money on card packs and been like, you know what? You get a legendary. Because you've bought so many card packs that I'm going to give you, you're guaranteed to get at least one rare card per pack. Or better, maybe I'm going to give you a legendary a little more frequently, ever so slightly more frequently than this guy over here who just thinks he can play the whole game for free. And you effectively construct a pay-to-win environment where the people who spend a whole bunch of money on card packs, maybe they're rewarded with better cards. I'm not saying that Hearthstone does this. I don't think anyone's run the numbers and found anything to that effect. But as more and more developers are looking to capitalize on Hearthstone's success, and everyone's rushing to create their own digital card games, I wouldn't be surprised if certain developers just covertly or overtly started rewarding players who paid for card packs instead of just, earned them through in-game currency.
But we talked about this a bit before, is that there are cards that are just statistically better in those expansions, and those are ones that cannot be crafted out of just pure grinding and making in-game resources. Those are cash money only.
Yeah. And that, that is a very overt example of these are guaranteed to be very powerful cards. The covert example that I'm talking about is when you say, hey, I'm selling you for 100 in-game gold this pack of cards, for $1 or $2 or whatever, I'm selling you a card pack. And the statistics that the card pack sold for actual money may contain more rare cards, and therefore the more cards you buy, the more likely you get not just rare cards, but maybe rare arena drops or that kind of thing. When you have that back end available to you, when you have this digital space available to you, it must be incredibly tempting not to take advantage of that and tweak things so that the paying players have a better experience.
There you go, card companies, don't do it.
It's a dark possibility that we need to be aware of.
Well, that was the episode on card games. You can find me on Twitter at GameThinkTalk.
And you can find me on Twitter at BluishGreenPro, or check out my website where you can submit user feedback about the show.
Bye for now.